We will now explain the procedure for mounting each part on the self-jector. This is the procedure for mounting the vertical shaft and related parts. The vertical shaft must be mounted before the horizontal shaft. If the horizontal shaft is mounted first, the angular bearing case of the vertical shaft will be placed in contact with the spiral gear, preventing assembly of the vertical shaft. Mount the lower spring. Set the steel ball on the spring seat to mount it. To mount the vertical shaft, align the keys mounted on the lower bearing case of the vertical shaft with a key groove on the lower bearing housing. With the vertical shaft free, mount the horizontal shaft. Apply grease to the lip of the oil seal mounted on the small bearing housing, taking care not to damage it, and mount the horizontal shaft. Align the keys of the upper bearing case with the key grooves on the upper bearing sleeve to mount the horizontal shaft. Check that the upper bearing housing is firmly mounted. Mount spacers on the upper bearing case, then mount the upper bearing case, taking care to align the flat springs correctly top and bottom. Measure the gap between the upper bearing housing and flat springs. The tolerance for this gap vary according to the model, so please consult your user's manual. If the measured gap is not within the tolerance, select the appropriate spacers and insert them to ensure that the gap is within the tolerance. Two types of spacers are supplied, 0.5 millimeters and 1.0 millimeter. Check that the gap between the upper bearing housing and flat spring is within the tolerance, then temporarily remove the upper bearing housing and set the O-ring. Apply grease to the O-ring groove before setting the O-ring. This prevents the O-ring from falling out. Align the keys mounted on the upper bearing case with the key groove on the upper bearing sleeve. At the same time, align the retaining bolts of the upper bearing housing. Insert spacers on the upper bearing case to the appropriate thickness, then set the flat spring. Mount the O-ring on the upper bearing housing, then mount upper bearing cap 2 and the upper bearing cover. Tighten the 3 bolts uniformly to fasten. Mount upper bearing cap 1, then mount the mist cover. This is the procedure for mounting the water supplying device. Mount the vertical shaft on the water supplying device. Fasten the 3 socket cap screws, then tighten the cap nuts on the operating water tube completely. Check that the water supplying device is set firmly. Then tighten the socket set screws on the chamber cover to fasten them to the vertical shaft. This completes the assembly of the vertical shaft system. This is the procedure for assembling the horizontal shaft. Mount the O-ring on the large bearing housing, then mount it on the horizontal shaft. At this point, apply grease to the oil seal, taking care not to damage the oil seal. Tighten the retaining bolts on the large bearing housing. Align the bolt holes on the large bearing housing with the bearing retainer and tighten. Mount the large bearing housing and small bearing housing with the oil grooves facing down. Mount the friction pulley. Align the keys on the horizontal shaft with the key grooves on the friction pulley and mount the horizontal shaft. At this point, check that the friction pulley is flush with the horizontal shaft collars. Mount the lock washer and lock nut, then turn the lock washer to fasten it. Mount the friction blocks on the friction boss using a rubber band like this. The number of friction blocks used varies according to the model and the frequency. Mount the appropriate number of friction blocks. If oil is found on the inner surface of the friction pulley and the outer surface of the friction block, wipe it away and dry it before mounting the motor. Lift the motor using the chain block and mount it on the self-jector, then fasten it with the bolts. Reconnect the motor, referring to the notes you took earlier. Mount the sheet packing on the drain plug and tighten. Insert the rated amount of lubricant in the gearbox and mount the gear cover. This is the procedure for mounting the gear pump. Fasten the gear pump, then align the gear pump shaft with the safety joint engagement of the horizontal shaft. Mount the safety joint. Connect the connecting tubes. After assembly, start the instant starter and check the direction of rotation. This completes the assembly of the entire Mitsubishi Self-Jector G-Series.